right? As usual, thanking God once again. Let's call Jeremiah chapter 46 presumption, or another look at presumption, going back to the way that we saw in Psalm 19. David offering up a prayer for God to keep him back from presumptuous sins, a prayer that would serve three kingdoms well in this chapter, even though it's a prophecy focused on the fall or the judgment against Egypt. Egypt would do well to learn from David's Psalm 19 prayer. So would Judah, and then finally Babylon, the nation brought as judgment against them both. All three are going to do well to understand the wisdom in David's prayer to keep me back as a leader from presumption, him as the king of Israel. However, this time, as we said, Egypt is the nation that would do well to understand God's warnings about presumption. All right, enough of a preamble, because in verses 1 through 2, it is literally going to give us a historical timestamp saying that in the reign of King Necho, or Pharaoh Necho, seeming to be the very same Pharaoh Necho who was the king that Josiah fell against when Josiah did not believe that Pharaoh Necho was on a mission from God, which he actually was. The same Pharaoh Necho is now going to see the condemnation of God, as in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, is going to defeat him in battle. Verses 3 through 12 are going to go on to describe the way in which the swift won't be able to flee, the warriors won't be able to fight their way out of it. They are going to stumble in the presence of what is coming, in the way of judgment from the north, from by the Euphrates. Understanding that the plans of their heart seem to be presumptuously, I will rise like a flood over the entire world, a plan that God is about to put to an end, as he seems to have assembled nations like Cush and Put and Lud in the effort that Nebuchadnezzar is making against Egypt for what he's going to call a day of vengeance. He's also going to talk about it is going to be a sacrifice prepared in the north by the, once again, Euphrates, as he's going to describe warrior stumbling against warrior. And once again, I'm going through these chapters a little bit more quickly than I'm used to, so I'm not super familiar with this description. But historically, at least in the Bible, this is not the first time we have seen God turn warrior against warrior, or soldier against soldier, understanding that in 2nd Chronicles chapter 20, round about verse 22, he's going to talk about the way in which Ammon, Moab, and what's described as Mount Seir came against Israel, only to have their soldiers turned against one another. Again, Isaiah seems to prophesy the same time period that we're seeing in Jeremiah 46, or quite possibly another time in which God is turning soldier against soldier in the kingdom of Egypt, because in Isaiah 19, he's going to talk about verse 2 saying, "And I will stir up Egyptian against Egyptian until they fight against each other, and each against his neighbor. City against city against city, and kingdom against kingdom," all pointing forward to what we have here in Jeremiah 46. However, in this chapter, verses 13 through 17, we're going to specify some words regarding Nebuchadnezzar. It's going to say, "Why are your warriors face down?" seeming to talk about the effect that the invasion has had on Egypt. Well, it's going to be because God has turned them face down, because he has turned against them, similar to what we saw prophesied in Jeremiah 13 about the way that God was about to turn against his people, Judah, because of the way they had turned on him. Verses 18 through 24, however, in this chapter, advising folks to pack a bag because the deportation is coming as a part of the judgment against Egypt, and historically against Judah as well. He's going to liken Egypt, however, to a beautiful heifer who is going to be coming against what is a biting fly, meaning size might not matter, because no matter how regal Egypt has become, the fly that God is bringing against them is going to be an annoyance, and it's going to be the kind of annoyance that's actually going to bring them into catastrophe. Understanding that the impenetrable forest that's going to be described in these verses is going to become penetrable because of the overwhelming challenge that Babylon is going to bring to Egypt. Verses 25 through 26, stating that this is a judgment against Egypt, its Pharaoh and its gods, and all who trust in them. Going back to a prophecy we seem to have seen in Isaiah, where he warned God's people about making alliances that were not of God, meaning they were self-motivated, meaning similar to what we saw out of the remnant trying to recover after the invasion of Judah. They were much too quick to make partnerships with seemingly powerful forces, regardless of their integrity, giving us a historical context for what we see happening once again here in Jeremiah 46, as the chapter will close out in verses 27 and 28, once again giving us another statement or a super similar statement to what we saw in chapter 30 of Jeremiah, where God promises to bring a full end of the nations to whom he is scattering Judah. But he will not bring Judah to a full end. However, they will not escape his justice, saying he will still discipline them in justice. In some ways, alluding to the promise he made to David to always have a man seated on his throne, a promise that seems to point forward to the Messiah, the Christ. This chapter quite possibly reminding me most of the kind of presumption we sometimes describe as given an inch, sometimes folks will want to take a mile, understanding that at least two of these kingdoms, having been set up by God to do his work, that being Egypt, when Pharaoh Necho was on a mission from God and even his king Josiah could not stand in the way of it, Necho had a commission from God to go and conquer. Likewise, Babylon here is given a mission from God to go and conquer and bring justice to Pharaoh Necho. However, the scope of authority that God gave them was not as much as the scope of authority they presumed they had, leading them into this irony. Having once been God's tool or instrument for judgment, their presumption transformed them into the object of his judgment. In much the same way we saw Isaiah start out with his prescription or his judgment against Israel, and then turning that into his judgment against the nations that were used to discipline Israel. In the same way, we see the book of Jeremiah ending up with the last 5 or so chapters focusing on his judgment of the nations he used to judge his people, reminding me of the way that these prophecies seem to point forward once again to the revelation and mysterious prophecies about things yet to come, things that over the years have interested me, like the identity of Babylon. Who is it? The subject of much guesswork by people who have a lot more book learning in the Bible than I do. But the fact that no one seems to be able to come to a consistent conclusion about who Babylon is may not matter when we see that God deals with all nations according to justice, meaning he's impartial. And so if we see a pattern in his judgment consistently applied to all nations, and as this chapter ends up, likewise justly applied to his people, then it seems to show us that God judges nations the same way he judges individuals, remembering that as he established the law in Israel, he set forth one rule for the native-born Israelite and one rule for those who sojourned amongst them, reminding us that in a time where having more influence can often get us more mercy, or mercy aside, in a time where might often makes right, men like David remind us that it does not work that way with God. A reminder that seems to describe much of what we'll see throughout the rest of the book of Jeremiah.